So this segment is dedicated to the two big fish in Sri Lankan English poetry, 1950s to the mid 1970s, Patrick Fernando and Lakdas Wikkramasinha. Two writers who are like two titans, two colossal presences in Sri Lankan English writing as a whole, but who, in my opinion and in my observation, are slowly but surely on their way out from literature curricula in the country. Patrick Fernando, I think, is more or less out, except his marginal presence in a few external degree courses. Lakdas Wikkramasinha manages to hold on, but I have a feeling that the way I look at the tendencies and preoccupations of the English Academy, I have a feeling in the next 5 years at the most, in the next 10 years, Lakdas will also get the ticket. Time to go home. But anyway, the two of them, Fernando and Wikkramasinghe, they are like two icons for a poetic idiom and a rich contribution to the post-independence phase of Sri Lankan English writing, poetry in particular. So, speaking of Patrick Fernando, born 1931, the demise 1983, much of his poetry that remains in circulation comes from his early life, written in the 1950s, and which reflect several important features which we can take into discussion. For example, if you take the poetry, something that's very prevalent across the board is Fernando's classical background, or his grooming in the classics. He is a classics scholar, which strategically comes into his writing and which gets quite prominently displayed, especially in terms of his craftsmanship, the writing, the kind of mold that he brings into the writing. Fernando's poems are very often a mixture of classical motifs, and these motifs can be seen in terms of certain elements that he factors into his writing, which resonate various aspects of the classical odes to the classical elegies, as well as classical thematics and approaches. So the classical motif is a kind of a dominant tick in the anatomy of his writing. And secondly, we have to a large degree personal themes, especially some of his shorter poems, poems like, for example, To Isabel, which I will come to in 2 minutes, 2 minutes time. So a fairly consistent body of poems that deal in personal themes. And also thirdly, an equally important body of poems that deal with local life. So these are like three easy categories into which I personally put Fernando's writing. Now, if you speak a bit more about poems that deal with local life, once again you can see two defining aspects of his writing embedded within this category, namely scenes and sights from coastal experience. Especially his own experiences get reflected here, drawn from life in the southwestern coast of Sri Lanka. And of course, another undeniable factor, which is Christianity. So there's a very strong Christian ethos and a Christian consciousness, as well as a consciousness that is drawn from coastal life, that goes into Fernando's writing. So this aspect about local life being featured in Fernando's writing is important because this negates a fairly widespread misconception that Fernando's writing is divorced from, or it's unconnected from various ground realities. So I think this is a kind of a claim a few scholars have. This is a claim which is unfair by Fernando, which a few scholars have drawn on in several articles. Um, Now, at their best, Fernando's poetry is an interfusion or an admixture of two or more of those three aspects that I highlighted: the classical motifs, the personal thematics, and scenes drawn from local life. So at the best, the poetry very often kind of brings together two or more of these threads. Now, a good example is his poem To Isabel, which is a short poem, 4 or 5 stanzas, uh, highly informed by his classical education. And one might even say that to a large degree, thematically, it has a very loose echo of Andrew Marvell's poem To His Coy Mistress, because the same kind of themes Marvell deals with in that poem, a very playful poem, can be seen in Fernando's poem as well. It is about youth, it is about love, romance, it is about aging, right? And there is a stern reminder to a particular lady. The poem is addressed possibly Isabel, that if one is going to fall in love and make a day out of it, might as well do it young. Hmm? So in that poem, you can see a kind of a coming together of the personal with the classical. Um, if you take another poem, like for example, The Life and Death of a Hawk, here you can see once again a scene from local life where there is a hawk descending from the sky, descending on a haystack from the sky to snatch a chicken that had been idling near the haystack, and the hawk, like in a split second, kind of snatches the chicken and goes back up. And this is a poem that has so that scene from local life, a very kind of a countryside scene. It is brought together. It's brought in conference with several classical motifs, including very prominent biblical reference. So there is a second example to contribute to our discussion. And thirdly, of course, a poem like Fisherman Mourned by His Wife, which is probably Patrick Fernando's most popular poem, where the Sri Lankan syllabus maker is concerned. This is a poem that is tirelessly in the curriculum, in curricula actually, in the plural, from the advanced level to university to external at different levels. Definitely, it's like a documentary from local life, a fishing village. A fisherman has died, and the poem unfolds as a narrative by the widow of the fisherman on the occasion of the funeral. Uh, how she recounts their life together from their young days, the gradual changes that take place in life as they settle down as a family, leading up to the death. So I think once again, Fisherman Mourned by His Wife is a good example to say that Fernando is not only interested in abstract abstract themes, that he's not a poet that is lost in the classical domain, but that he has a lot to offer in terms of ground level reality, hardships included. There are few poems that stand out for me, which kind of still remain with me many years after I first encountered them. Poems like Adam and Eve, Aeneas and Dido. Some of these titles themselves reflect the classical influence. Then poems like Meditation Over Five Graves, and also The Decline of Aspasia. So once again, the classical echo is there. And one of my firm favorites of Fernando's bibliography, Elegy for My Son. So that is largely Patrick Fernando. Now, the other name that gets mentioned with Fernando is that of Lakdas Wikkramasinha, who, in my opinion, is the finest poet Sri Lanka has produced this side of independence. And I think this, for a change, is not a controversial view. There are many others who agree with this assessment. Now, Wickramasinghe died young at the age of 37. He was born 1941, drowned in 1978 off Mount Lavinia. And he is important for his bilingual poetic sensibility. So he has published, as I remember, 4 collections of poetry, starting with Luster Poems, 1965, and then he follows that up with 15 poems 5 years later. He has a Sinhalese collection of poetry, Janaki Harane and Vinat Janaki Harane Saha, not and Janaki Harane Saha Vinat Kavi, and of course his enigmatic poetry collection from 1976, a 5-paged collection of poetry, O Regal Blood. So this is Lakdas Wikkramasinghe. Now, Wickramasinghe's writing, for me, you can kind of dissect it and put it into 4 broad categories for study purposes, for the purpose of convenience, I should say, not study purposes, for the purposes of convenience. So we have one category, poetry, which kind of present a very strong anti-colonial vibe. And to a certain degree, this category, the anti-colonial category, has something to share with a second branch of Wickramasinghe's poetry that is largely immersed in the idea of a lost heritage, a kind of an assessment he makes of a rupture in history, which is caused by European imperialism or colonization. So these are like 2 branches, but which share some common ground depending on the poem and the particular discussion that he emerges in. He emerges on. Now, a very good example for the anti-colonial branch is his poem "Don't Talk to Me About Matisse." Now, as I mentioned briefly in the earlier lecture, this position that "Don't Talk to Me About Matisse" has an anti-colonial purpose is challenged by my good friend Anne-Marie de Silva, who wrote a paper a few years ago titled "Recentering the Post-Colonial Subject, the Poetry of Lakdas Wikkramasinghe." Now, I'm not going to contest that at this point because it kind of falls outside my purpose of this engagement. But I would definitely like to quote that highly quotable, widely quoted Lakdas Wikkramasinghe statement, which comes as a note at the end of his Luster Poems collection from 1965, where Lakdas says that, this is what he says: "I have come to realize that I am using the language of the most despicable and loathsome people on earth To write in English, he's talking about the English, obviously. To write in English is a form of cultural treason. I have had for the future to think of a way of circumventing this treason. I propose to do this by making my writing entirely immoralist and destructive. So these are like the so-called devastating words of Lakdas Wikkramasinha, but pretty much in the line of many other writers of his generation, especially freshly emerging from hundreds of years of European colonial domination. Another name that comes to mind, one of you can call him one of Wickramasinghe's contemporaries, but from a different continent, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So if you kind of go through Ngugi wa Thiong'o's famous treatise, Decolonization of the Mind, uh, some of some of the some of the energy that Wickramasinghe tables here comes pretty much par with some of Ngugi's own passionate ideas for a post-colonial universe. So that is one category, the anti-colonial, which meets poems that deal with a rupture in history in search of a local heritage. So a few poems that comes to mind in this second category are poems like The Stones of Akurati Valavu, in ancient Kothumale, The Three Sisters, The Waters. These are all poems that kind of try to work towards a lost heritage, or which kind of locates glimmers or glimpses of something bigger that has deteriorated or that is lost over time. Deteriorated is the wrong word. I would say that has been lost over time. Then there's a third category, in Wickramasinghe's case, poems that deal with class tensions and class relations. So you have two classes, often a dominating and a dominated class, and there are poems that kind of investigate the interplay between these two positions. Very often you see a Valauva, the presence of a Valauva, and Wickramasinghe's own response to the Valauva is a bit ambiguous. There are some poems where the Valauva identity is venerated, where it is endorsed, and this is especially in relation to his own ancestral roots, aristocratic to the touch. And then there is another branch where his relation to the Valauva is a questioning or an undermining of its superiority by exposing an underbelly that is very controversial. But one way or the other, this category of poems that deal with a dominator and a dominating class uh, brings into the fore of discussion the subtle power relations that kind of exist between the two power players. So a few poems that comes to mind, poems like The Death of Ashanti and To a Servant Girl, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a very a scathing, it kind of scathingly dissects that underbelly to expose an ugly side to the dominating power agent. Both The Death of Ashanti, in which he kind of incriminates not only his own people, his own ancestors, as being abusive of people without privilege, marginalized people within that power structure, but he quite, in a way, brings himself into that equation as well, because he, towards the end of the poem, the narrator, he slash the narrator, identifies or he submits himself as an abuser, as one of the abusers of Ashanti. Then, of course, there are poems like uh, from the life of the folk poet Isinho, once again there's a Walauer connection, and also poems like Discarded Tins. Discarded Tins, published in 1970. In this case, it's not a Walauer that is brought into the equation, but the relationship between a kind of a petit bourgeois, an urban petit bourgeois class, and the slum dwellers who live in the margins of the uh, urban community, almost as its detritus. But definitely, once again, that interplay between two uh, uh, two agents that form the parity of that urban milieu. Also, I think included into this list would be all the poems in his 1976 collection, or Regal Blood, which is more or less like a celebration of his own forebears. Now, Wickramasinghe's poetry can be very violent, and it is a power pack with so many aspects of violent play, starting from homicide, you got suicide, sexual perversion, arson. In Death of Ashanti, there is a reference to arson, madness, stabbing. You got guns, you got bombs, you got knives, you got entire armories at display. You have spiking, heads of people spiked along fences, and you have references to the consumption of acid. So it's a very vibrant and violent poetry. But Wickramasinghe's call for fame, I would say, is his originality in both imagination and idiom. It's very raw and devastating in terms of imagery and the kind of sensibility that he evokes. Um, Now, of all Wickramasinghe's poems, if I had to make a pick, there are two poems I would definitely want to. I have to say, Wickramasinghe, I'm very partial to Wickramasinghe's writing, his sensibility, and the kind of, especially the poetic language, the idiom he works with. But for purposes here, if I have to kind of narrow down my pick to two poems, one would be his playful and mischievous backhanded slap at colonial culture and class superiority to my friend Aldred. That's definitely one poem. And the second poem would be a poem that goes unnoticed very often, and this is included in his first collection, Luster Poems. It's called The Disciple. It's a poem where the narrator seems to be a teacher, a university, or I don't know, a teacher uh, whose student or disciple follows him quite loyally. And at a crucial point, the teacher, in the guise of letting the student overtake him, actually stabs him to death. So that's the kind of surface of the narrative. So this is a poem, whenever I discuss it, especially in university, I say that this is a poem that should be taught very young, preferably in the first year in campus. Usually, Sri Lankan literature, this course comes a bit later in the syllabus, third year most of the time. But I say that by then it is too late. You have to teach this poem very early to save people a lot of trouble if you teach it young. So I think Wickramasinghe, to sum up, I would also like to kind of make a point. This is more in jest than in seriousness. The kind of similarity Lakdas Wikkramasinghe's career had with the career of Percy Shelley, at least in terms of Shelley and Wickramasinghe's deaths, and the point those deaths occurred. Both poets, interestingly, died at the age of 37, and water. It was not by fire, but by water that both of them died. Shelley drowned, and Wickramasinghe himself went for a swim, and that was that. He never came back. And also the kind of political conviction both writers had at one level. Both Wickramasinghe, in his attack of the superior elite class of society, as well as the empire or the colonial powerhouse, and a similar strain can be seen in Shelley's writing, in his attack on the British royalty, the British crown. And of course, in spite of the undermining of the social elites and the aristocrats, both writers belonging to the social elite, to the top tier of society.